The boardroom was a polished fortress of power, with walls lined in sleek glass and leather, each corner of the room echoing with the voices of the top-tier executives. They were gathered around a glossy conference table, discussing the deal of the century, a billion-dollar merger that could change everything. Emma Langley sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk, her confidence unshakable. The weight of the moment was on her shoulders, but she wore it like a crown. Every word that came from her lips was a command. Every suggestion from the others was carefully measured against her vision. The deal was crucial, the kind of negotiation that could elevate her to the next level of business royalty. She was the queen of this empire, and no one dared question her authority. "If we play our cards right," she said, her voice commanding the room's attention, "this merger will secure us as the #1 tech giant globally. No one can touch us." But outside that glass fortress, Darryl stood in the lobby, as invisible as the air around him. His uniform, a crisp black suit with a hint of polish on his shoes, spoke of professionalism, but not power. He was the driver, just a driver. To the people in the boardroom, his worth was measured in miles driven, doors opened, and bags carried. Darryl had learned to accept this. He'd been around these people long enough to understand his place, and his place was at the back of the room, out of sight, out of mind. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to be seen. As Emma Langley's voice carried through the glass, Darryl felt the familiar sting of insignificance. He adjusted his tie, stood up a little straighter, but the truth gnawed at him. The doors to the boardroom were closed. The conversations inside were always too important, too elevated. It wasn't his world. Inside the room, Emma's laughter rang out, echoing off the walls as she dismissed a minor concern from one of her subordinates. Her smile was sharp, calculating, and the way she spoke to them, with a mixture of professionalism and superiority, only reinforced her position. Her eyes flickered across the table, occasionally pausing to deliver a snide remark about someone's suggestion. But all eyes stayed locked on her. She was untouchable, a queen at the top of her castle. But it didn't always feel like a castle. The deal wasn't going as smoothly as she had hoped. Emma's confident face began to tighten as she noticed the growing unease among her team. The international partner they were negotiating with, a billionaire businessman named Guowei, had his own ideas. The language barrier between him and the executives was becoming more pronounced by the minute. Mandarin, French, Spanish. The words slipped through their hands like water. Emma adjusted her glasses, but the tension in her jaw told a different story. She glanced around the table. They had agreed to meet with Guowei, but his communication had hit a wall. He was frustrated. They were desperate. Emma, always the one to take control, began to speak faster, trying to salvage the conversation in broken French. Her voice grew louder as she forced the words out, but Guowei's expression only darkened. It was clear. She couldn't reach him. She had tried everything she could think of, and now, the deal that she thought was in the bag was slipping away. "Does anyone else here speak Mandarin?" Emma's voice cut through the room, a hint of panic buried in her otherwise calm tone. No one spoke. Emma's eyes darted across the table, desperate for a solution, but the silence rang louder than any of her words. In the back of the room, Darryl shifted his weight from foot to foot. He had been standing there, waiting, minding his own business, when the door opened. One of the senior executives poked his head out, his gaze quickly scanning the lobby, and then he spotted Darryl. Emma didn't hear it at first. The murmurs in the room were all-consuming. Her focus was locked on the failing negotiation. But then, the voice from outside broke the silence, and the executive called into the room. We have a solution." Emma froze, turning to the voice. There was something in his tone that made her stop mid-thought. The door opened fully, and there stood Darryl. He was calm, collected, so different from the frantic atmosphere she had been drowning in. His steady presence in the doorway almost seemed like a dream. He stepped into the room, his movements deliberate. The atmosphere shifted. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, it was as if Darryl had stepped out of the background and into the spotlight. All eyes were on him. I can help, Darrell said, his voice steady but soft, almost too quiet for such a tense moment. Emma blinked, staring at the man who had always been just a shadow to her. A simple driver. What was he doing in the room? Did he even know what was at stake? He continued, undeterred by the silence. I speak Mandarin. French. Spanish, he said, his words cutting through the heavy air. Emma's eyes widened as the realization hit her. This was no accident. This man, this driver, was more than just a passenger in the shadows. His calmness in the face of her humiliation, his ability to step up when all seemed lost, suddenly became undeniable. The condescending smile that had once sat so comfortably on her face began to fade. She looked at him now, really looked at him, for the first time. All those years of dismissing him, of undermining him with her laughter, now seemed so small. Excuse me? Emma's voice barely rose above a whisper, her mind still processing what was unfolding before her. I can speak all 3 languages, Darrell repeated, a bit more firmly this time. I'll handle the negotiations. The room was silent again, but this time, it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding. Emma's gaze shifted from Darrell to the rest of the executives, their faces filled with surprise, some even with disbelief. And in that moment, Emma realized just how much she had underestimated this man. The irony of the situation hit her hard. The driver, the very person she had mocked, now held the key to saving her billion-dollar deal. The camera zoomed in on Emma's face, and for a fleeting moment, her world, her confidence, everything she thought she knew, seemed to shatter. Darrell was no longer just the driver. He was the one who could change everything. And in that instant, Emma Langley knew her life, her empire, would never be the same. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on Emma. The bright lights that once illuminated her power now seemed to cast shadows, and she could feel every pair of eyes on her as she tried to keep her composure. The deal was slipping through her fingers, no matter how hard she tried to grip it. Guowei, the billionaire partner sitting across from her, crossed his arms. His expression was stone-cold, unreadable, but there was a fire in his eyes, an anger that was unmistakable. His silence had grown heavy, oppressive, and each second it stretched, the more Emma felt the walls closing in. She had studied Mandarin and French in college, she had prepared, but it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. The words she threw out in broken Mandarin seemed to hang in the air, out of place, uncomfortable. Guowei's eyebrows furrowed deeper. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the sleek surface of the table, his impatience growing. The conversation had shifted from tense to downright awkward, and Emma could feel it, her every word making the situation worse. Her confidence, once unshakable, now felt like an illusion, and the table, once a symbol of her authority, felt like a barrier between her and the deal she was about to lose. Guowei leaned back in his chair, the frustration visible in the twitch of his jaw. This is not what I expected, he muttered in Mandarin, glancing at his translator. His tone, cold and final, sent a chill through the room. Emma could see the deal she had worked so hard for, the deal she had convinced her board members and investors to back, teetering on the edge of collapse. She tried again, this time in broken French, but her words were shaky, faltering. Monsieur, please, we can find a way forward, she said, her voice wavering. But as soon as the words left her mouth, she saw Guowei's eyes narrow, his frustration turning into open disdain. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed in the quiet room. I don't have time for this, he said in flawless French, his voice hard like stone. He turned to leave, his back now fully to Emma. I'm done. The air in the room thickened. Emma's hands trembled, clutching the sides of the conference table. She wasn't used to this, used to being the one in control. She was Emma Langley, the CEO who closed deals, who made things happen. But right now, she felt small. Like a child playing dress-up in a grown-up world. Her words were failing her. This was the one deal she couldn't afford to lose. The executives around the table were silent, watching, waiting for Emma to do something, anything, to fix the situation. But the power dynamic had shifted. The man she had once looked down on, Darryl, the lowly driver, was still standing quietly at the back of the room, unnoticed by everyone except Emma. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. In the midst of this escalating disaster, Darryl was the only one not rattled. The one person who had no stake in this deal, who had no reason to be part of the conversation, was the one who was calm, composed even. While the rest of them scrambled to salvage a deal, Darryl stood tall, a silent figure of control in the chaos. And then, in the silence, Darryl stepped forward. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she turned to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. What was he doing? What could he possibly do in this room full of powerful businesspeople, each more qualified than him, each more important than him? Darryl's calm presence cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter. He walked with quiet authority, his gaze never leaving Guowei's retreating form. Emma opened her mouth, ready to stop him, but then she saw it in his eyes, confidence, something she hadn't expected from him. His steady pace, his calm demeanor spoke volumes. This was no ordinary driver. He was different. He wasn't playing the role they had assigned to him. Mr. Wei, Darryl said, his voice clear, confident, and sharp. He spoke Mandarin, fluent Mandarin, with perfect diction, a stark contrast to Emma's broken attempt just moments ago. The room fell still. Emma's mouth went dry as she watched Darryl address the billionaire in his native tongue. His tone wasn't just a plea for understanding, it was a command. Guowei froze, his back still turned to the room. Slowly, he turned back toward Darryl, his eyes narrowing with surprise. The tension in the room crackled as Guowei took a step forward. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Darryl. And that, somehow, made all the difference. Darryl's eyes met his, unwavering. Please, let's finish this deal, he said, switching to flawless French. This is too important for both of us. Let me help you understand. The words flowed effortlessly from him, each one a reminder that Darryl wasn't who Emma thought he was. He wasn't just the driver. He was something more. Emma watched in awe as Guowei's face softened. He didn't speak for a moment, processing the situation. The weight of his frustration seemed to lift, replaced by a reluctant respect. Slowly, he nodded. Continue, he said in perfect French. Let's continue. Darryl didn't hesitate. He switched effortlessly to Spanish, filling the gaps, negotiating terms, calming the room, and easing the tension with every word. It was as if he had taken control of the situation, spinning the conversation into a thread of understanding, one word at a time. The deal, which had been on the brink of destruction just moments ago, was now slowly falling back into place. Emma, who had been fighting for this deal for months, could only watch as Darryl worked his magic, his every word sealing the fate of a billion-dollar agreement. The room's atmosphere shifted. The power had shifted. Darryl, the driver, was now the one who held the room together, the one who held the deal in his hands. And Emma, once so confident, was left to swallow her pride. She watched Darryl, her mind reeling. How had this happened? How had she allowed herself to miss the depth of the person standing in front of her? She had mocked him. She had dismissed him. And now, he had saved her career. She had been the one scrambling, failing, and Darryl had been the one to save the day. The deal was back on. The room breathed again. Emma's pride was bruised, but the truth was undeniable. Darryl, the lowly driver, had saved the day. And the question that lingered in the air was impossible to ignore. How could she have been so blind? The air in the room grew thick with silence as Darryl's voice rang clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. He spoke fluently in Mandarin, each word sharp, precise, and confident. Emma sat motionless at the table, her hands clenched tightly in front of her, watching in disbelief as Darryl weaved through the complex negotiation like a seasoned diplomat. The foreign language sounded effortless coming from him, as if it was just another part of him. His words didn't just bridge a gap, they created a connection, transforming the atmosphere from one of impending disaster to one of calm understanding. At first, Emma couldn't believe what she was witnessing. This was the same man she had mocked, the same man she had dismissed as nothing more than a driver. Yet now, Darrow was the one in control. His voice, calm and steady, commanded the room in a way Emma had never seen before. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her arrogance slipping away with every word he spoke. The room, once filled with the stifling weight of frustration, had transformed into something else. The tension melted away as Darrow, the quiet, unnoticed figure in the back of the room, took charge. Guo Wei, the billionaire businessman, stood silently, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like the deal was still in jeopardy, but Darrow's words worked their magic. With every sentence, Guo Wei's posture softened. The cold, distant figure that had once seemed so unapproachable began to warm. Darrow wasn't just translating the words, he was reading the room, understanding the underlying tension between the two parties and using his words to soothe the friction. He wasn't just a negotiator, he was a bridge, a connector of people who spoke different languages but shared the same desire: success. Emma's mind raced as she sat there, her thoughts spinning. How had this happened? How had Darrow gone from being an invisible presence in the background to the focal point of the room? The arrogance she had carried into this meeting, that same dismissive attitude toward Darrow, now felt like a distant memory. She had been wrong about him. So wrong. And now, watching him work, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of shame. Guo Wei, once skeptical, now leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Darrow. There was respect in his gaze, real respect. "You speak well," Guo Wei said, switching to English, his voice heavy with admiration. "Very well." Darrow nodded once, his expression calm, professional. "Thank you. It's my pleasure to help," he replied, the humility in his voice almost startling. Guo Wei studied him for a moment longer, and then, to Emma's surprise, he leaned back in his chair, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You know," he began, his tone thoughtful, "this could be much more than just a merger. If you are as skilled with business as you are with languages, perhaps we can discuss more than just the initial terms." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The deal was shifting, morphing into something more, and she could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. The billion-dollar partnership that had seemed like a distant dream was now in their reach, thanks to Darrow. Guo Wei turned his attention to Emma, his eyes narrowing slightly as he addressed her for the first time since the negotiation had started. "I had reservations," he said, his voice still smooth, but now with a hint of challenge. "I wasn't sure about the value of this partnership. But now, I see the potential. I see the value of your team, and your negotiator." Emma, still processing the shock of the moment, opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was struggling to keep up. She had spent so long thinking she was the one in charge, the one with the answers. But now, as the room shifted under Darrow's command, Emma found herself struggling to catch up. Guo Wei wasn't done. He turned back to Darrow, his tone changing once again, this time more serious. "What would you think about expanding this deal? We could increase the partnership to include additional incentives. $1 billion deal is just the beginning. If you're able to negotiate the terms the way you've handled this conversation, there is much more I'm willing to offer." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of something bigger, more valuable than Emma had ever dreamed possible. Darrow's calm face didn't betray any emotion, but his eyes, for the briefest of moments, flickered with understanding. He was aware of the shift. The power had changed hands. What had once been a desperate attempt to save a deal had now become the birth of something far more lucrative. Emma could feel the weight of the room on her. She had been a spectator, a bystander in her own meeting. Darrow, the man she had underestimated, had not only saved the deal, he had elevated it beyond anything she had imagined. She had laughed at him before, dismissed him with the wave of her hand, and now, in front of her, was the stark realization of just how wrong she had been. The tables had turned. Emma Langley, the confident CEO who had once commanded rooms with a glance, was now left in the shadow of the man she had ridiculed. Darryl was no longer just the driver. He was the one holding the cards, the one with the power to reshape everything. The realization struck Emma hard, and she couldn't ignore the weight of it. She had been so focused on her own success, on proving herself to the world, that she had missed the value of the people around her. Darryl's soft voice broke through her thoughts once more. "I think this partnership could be something truly special," he said, his words now directed at both Guowei and Emma. "But it will require trust. It will require respect. And above all, it will require a commitment to working together." Guowei smiled, a genuine smile now, and nodded. "I agree. Let's make this partnership work." The deal, which had teetered on the edge of failure just moments ago, was now secured, and more. The billion-dollar agreement had become the foundation of something far greater. And it was all thanks to Darryl. Emma sat back in her chair, her mind still racing, her emotions in a whirlwind. The power dynamic had shifted, and she was left to reconcile with the truth. Darryl had not only saved the deal, but he had expanded it beyond anything she had ever imagined. Her arrogance, her dismissal of him, it was all laid bare now. Darryl wasn't just the driver. He was the man who had reshaped her future. As the room filled with the sound of congratulations and handshakes, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of humility she had never known before. She had learned the hard way that true power didn't come from titles or positions, it came from recognizing the worth in others. And in this moment, she understood just how much Darryl had to offer. The deal was done, but the lesson was just beginning. The power had shifted, and Emma Langley was now, finally, humble enough to see it. The room was alive with celebration. Laughter and applause filled the air as the deal was sealed, $1 billion. The figures were firm now, written in ink, and the future was looking brighter than ever. Executives were clapping each other on the back, exchanging business cards, and congratulating Emma for her brilliance. But she wasn't celebrating. Not like they were. Not like she used to. Emma Langley stood at the edge of the room, her eyes glazed, her smile forced. She watched as her team gathered in a circle, basking in their success, but there was a weight on her chest that she couldn't shake. The echo of Darryl's words, his calm presence in the room, it all hung in the air like an invisible cloud. The deal had been saved, but not by her. Not by her leadership or her expertise, but by him. Darryl. The man she had once mocked. The man who had stood silently by her side for years, his worth never recognized until now. The truth was staring her in the face, and she couldn't ignore it. She excused herself from the group, walking toward the quiet corner where Darryl had taken a step back, letting the executives revel in their success. He wasn't part of their circle. Not yet, at least. And somehow, that felt wrong to Emma. He deserved more. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but something inside of her pushed her to move, to finally face the truth. As she approached him, Darryl stood with a quiet dignity, his eyes meeting hers without judgment. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had already spoken louder than words. But Emma needed to speak, needed to atone for what she had done. For the years of dismissal, for the arrogance, for the ignorance. "I owe you an apology," Emma said softly, the words heavy on her tongue. I didn't see you. I didn't see your value. I thought I knew everything, that I had everything figured out. But you were the one who saved this deal. You were the one who made this happen." Darryl looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, held something deeper. It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't anger. It was understanding. He nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly in acknowledgement. "I was just doing my job," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "But you did more than that," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. She swallowed hard, the weight of her realization pressing down on her chest. "You showed me something I didn't know I needed to see. You taught me humility. You taught me respect." There was a long pause between them, the sound of the celebration in the background now faint, almost distant. Darryl didn't speak immediately, but his eyes softened. He didn't need to hear the apology to know what it meant. His actions had already shown him his worth. He had never needed Emma's recognition to understand his value. I wasn't looking for recognition, Darryl said quietly, his gaze unwavering. I was just doing what needed to be done. But I'm glad it helped. Emma nodded, her throat tight. I was wrong about you, she said. I was wrong about so many things. Her eyes lowered, unable to meet his gaze for a moment. She had been so focused on proving herself, on being the one with the answers, that she had missed the value in the people around her, the people like Darryl, who had so much more to offer than their roles implied. She took a deep breath, finally meeting his eyes again. You saved this company, she said, the weight of her words finally sinking in. And you saved me from my own ignorance. Darryl gave a slight smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet understanding. We all have something to offer. Sometimes it takes a little time for others to see it. Emma was silent for a moment, the enormity of his words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about the deal. It was about everything she had taken for granted. The power dynamics. The roles. The assumptions. Darryl's quiet resilience had shattered all of it. He had shown her that true leadership wasn't about titles or positions, it was about recognizing the value in others, no matter their place in the world. The room around them was still alive with celebration, but Emma felt a profound shift within herself. The applause for the deal was no longer the loudest thing in her world. The realization of Darryl's strength, his dignity, was what reverberated through her soul. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the most important qualities of leadership were humility and respect, not control and dominance. I don't know what the future holds, Emma said, her voice steady now. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never underestimate anyone again. Darryl nodded, his eyes calm, but his presence radiating a quiet strength. I'm glad to hear that. And with that, Emma felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that room, arrogant and dismissive. She wasn't the woman who had judged Darryl for his role in her world. She was someone different now, someone who understood that power came not from control, but from recognition of the people who worked beside you, who supported you, who made things happen when you couldn't. Darryl had shown her the way, not through words, but through his actions. And that was worth more than any deal, any title, or any amount of money. As the celebration continued around them, Emma knew the road ahead would be different. It had to be. She had seen the truth, and that truth had transformed her. The lesson was clear: never judge a person by their role, for you never know when they might be the one to change the world. The room wasn't just filled with people anymore, it was filled with a newfound respect, a deeper understanding, and a shared belief in the power of recognizing the worth in others, no matter where they stood. And that, Emma realized, was the true meaning of success.